Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, and the first thing you see is your best friend being murdered right next to you. Now imagine staying perfectly still, because the only way to survive is to pretend you're already dead. I've spent most of my career chasing the aftermath of monsters, peeling back the layers of blood and lies they leave behind. But no story has ever haunted me quite like the night a 10-year-old girl named Krystal Surles stared death in the face and didn't blink. It was December 30th, 1999. Somewhere in the rural stretch of Del Rio, Texas, the Surles family was between homes, mid-move, and thankful for the kindness of family friends. The Harris family had offered them a place to stay, a modest house tucked off a dusty road, the kind where porch lights flicker and every creak of the floorboards carries for miles. The girls, Krystal and her younger sister Marky, were grateful to spend a few nights away from the chaos of packing and transition. Krystal had bonded almost instantly with the Harris's 13-year-old daughter, Katie. Two peas in a pod, really, full of that giggly energy only young girls have when they're staying up too late and talking about nothing and everything. That night, Krystal asked if she could sleep over in Katie's room, and with a smile, her parents said yes. Her little sister Marky wanted to join too, but the older girls, in their charming, innocent selfishness, told her to sleep in the next room. That decision would end up saving Marky's life. I interviewed Krystal years later, grown, strong, composed, but I could still see the faint echo of that little girl behind her eyes. She told me about that night in painful detail. The warmth of the extra blanket Katie gave her, the way they lay side by side whispering until sleep finally pulled them under. She'd never forget how peaceful it had all felt. How safe. But safety is a fragile illusion, especially in Texas, and especially when evil is walking just outside your window. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that a man had been watching the Harris house. A drifter, a killer, someone who moved from town to town, unnoticed and forgotten, until blood marked his path. That night, he didn't come for a reason. He came for a feeling. He came for the kill. They say that in most true crime stories, the horror begins with a broken lock or a left-open door. But this man didn't need a key. He brought darkness with him, and it slipped in silently, like smoke. Katie never had a chance. The next few minutes would forever be burned into Krystal's memory, and eventually, mine too. What Krystal Surles endured that night in Del Rio is something that shakes even the most seasoned investigators. What happened in that room should have killed her. By all logic, it should have ended like so many other tragic cases. But somehow it didn't. It began with a sound. Not loud, not even clear, just a subtle shift in the air that made Krystal stir under the covers. She opened her eyes slightly, just enough to see a shadow at the foot of the bed. She told me it was like waking into a nightmare you can't quite understand yet. You're too foggy to act, too stunned to scream. There was a man, not someone she knew, just a tall figure looming over the bed, and in his hand, something sharp caught a glint of light. Katie woke up first. Krystal doesn't remember the scream exactly. She remembers the feeling of it. That guttural, terrified sound that shattered the silence of the house. And then the blade came down. The man was fast. Too fast. There was no struggle, no time to cry out for help. Katie was gone in seconds. Krystal froze. Her instincts told her one thing: stay still. She closed her eyes, slowed her breath, and prayed. She felt the mattress shift as the killer moved. She heard his breathing. She told me she could smell his sweat, like old motor oil and cigarettes. She could feel his weight in the room, even when he stepped away. And then, he stopped. He must have sensed her. Maybe it was the slight rise and fall of her chest, maybe just a flicker of movement beneath her eyelids. But something made him turn back. Krystal opened her eyes for just a moment. It was enough. The man lunged toward her and slashed, a deep, violent cut across her throat. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her vocal cords were gone in an instant. She remembers the silence, the pure, terrifying silence, more than the pain. The blood poured out fast. She went limp, convincing him it was done. And just like that, he left. He didn't run. He slipped out the way he came, through the bedroom window, leaving behind two broken little girls and a room that would never feel safe again. What happened next defies belief. Krystal, still bleeding, barely able to breathe, pulled herself out of bed. Her hands pressed to her neck, trying to hold in the life that was spilling out. She stumbled down the hallway, past the room where her sister Marky lay sleeping. She couldn't speak. She couldn't scream. But somehow, she made it to the master bedroom. The Harris parents woke to the sight of a child covered in blood, trying to write on the walls with her fingers. They called 911. When EMTs arrived, they weren't sure Krystal would survive the ride to the hospital. The wound had missed her carotid artery by less than a millimeter. The doctors said it was a miracle, the kind you don't expect, not in this line of work. And somehow, through it all, Krystal never passed out. Not once. I asked her once, years later, how she held on. She just shrugged and said, "I knew he couldn't know I was alive. If he came back." She didn't need to finish that sentence. I understood. Next came the police. The hunt. The search for a face without a name. And it all started with a little girl, barely 10, who couldn't speak, but was determined to tell the truth. When I first visited Del Rio to investigate this case, one of the officers who arrived that night told me something I'll never forget. He said, "She couldn't speak, but she gave us more than most adults ever do." Krystal Surles, 10 years old, her throat stitched and her voice taken, still found a way to fight. The hours after the attack were critical. Doctors worked to stabilize her, but the sheriff's department was already assembling outside the hospital room. They had one goal: get a description of the killer before her memory faded. But how do you question a child who physically can't answer? Paper and pen. That's how it began. Krystal was weak, her hand trembling with every word she tried to write. But she was clear, precise. She described him: white male, mid to late 30s, longish greasy hair, mustache, dirty shirt, worn jeans. She remembered a tattoo on his arm. She couldn't say what it was, but she remembered the ink. And then she wrote something chilling. He came through the window. The officers read her notes in silence. They knew what this meant. He hadn't broken in. He'd slipped in, quiet and calm. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. Experienced. He'd done this before. The lead investigator, Sheriff Don Seward, immediately recognized the pattern. He told me later, the scene didn't look like a first-time kill. He knew where to go, what to do, how to disappear. Krystal was the key. Over the next few days, police artists worked with her to create a composite sketch. She was still unable to speak, but she nodded, pointed, and corrected every detail until the drawing looked just right. The sketch went out across Texas, then beyond. And that's when a tip came in. A woman named Terry Harris, the same woman whose daughter had been murdered, believed she recognized the man from her past. She remembered a drifter named Tommy Lynn Sells who had done some odd jobs for the family once, years ago. Nothing specific had happened, but she recalled something off about him. The way he watched the girls. The way he lingered. That name, Tommy Lynn Sells, would turn out to be far more than just a drifter. Krystal confirmed it immediately. She was shown a photo lineup, and though her hands were still bandaged, she pointed right at him without hesitation. I've seen a lot of lineups. Most survivors second guess. They hesitate. Not Krystal. This little girl had just helped identify one of America's most dangerous serial killers, and she did it without ever saying a word. What happened next unraveled one of the darkest trails I've ever followed. Sells had moved through the country like a shadow, one town to the next, never staying long. No home. No fingerprints in the system that matched. No paper trail. He was invisible. Until now. The arrest would come quickly, but what they'd uncover afterward would be enough to make even veteran homicide detectives go pale. There's something profoundly disturbing about a killer with no pattern, no type, no consistent motive, no preferred weapon. That's what made Tommy Lynn Sells so terrifying. He didn't fit the mold. He didn't even care to. When Krystal Surles pointed to his picture, it set off a chain reaction that spanned multiple states. Law enforcement agencies from across the country started making calls. Suddenly, unsolved homicides, long gone cold, began to echo with new relevance. And it all led back to one man. Sells was arrested in early January 2000, less than a week after the attack on Krystal and the murder of Katie Harris. He was hiding out in a trailer park not far from the Texas border. When officers showed up, he didn't resist. That still haunts me. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He simply opened the door, as if he knew it was over. But it wasn't over, not even close. Once in custody, he began to talk. Not defensively. Not regretfully. He spoke with the calm, casual tone of someone reciting weather patterns. Over the next several weeks, he confessed to crimes in more than a dozen states: stabbings, shootings, drownings, strangulations. He murdered men, women, children. Whole families, in some cases. The youngest victim he admitted to killing was just 4 years old. I remember sitting in the Behar County Courthouse, listening to tapes of those interviews. You'd think the horror would be in what he described, but no. The horror was in how he described it. No emotion. No hesitation. Just facts. Dates. Locations. How he got in. What he used. How he left. He was a drifter, homeless since his teens, addicted to drugs, mentally unstable, deeply traumatized from a childhood riddled with abuse. But none of that explained the pleasure he seemed to take in recounting his crimes. He claimed his first murder was at age 15, a man he beat to death in Mississippi. After that, it was like a dam had broken. He never stopped moving. Never stopped hunting. Sells didn't keep trophies. He didn't stalk victims in the traditional sense. He often chose them randomly. Many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He traveled by hitchhiking, hopping trains, breaking into houses at night. In some cases, he attacked while high on methamphetamine or drunk, but in others, he was stone sober. The FBI started comparing his movements to old case files. Bodies that had gone unidentified. Cases marked, unsolved, suddenly had a suspect. Not all could be proven, but enough matched his stories, names, towns, details only the killer could know, that investigators started to believe the unimaginable. Tommy Lynn Sells may have been responsible for over 70 murders. Some detectives doubted the number. Others believed it could be more. He had no reason to lie. In fact, it seemed he enjoyed the attention, the headlines, the spotlight. He basked in it. I remember one prison interview where a reporter asked him directly, "Do you regret any of it?" He paused for a moment, looked into the camera, and said, "You don't regret what you are." That line still echoes in my head. But none of it, none of his darkness, would have come to light without Krystal. It was her identification, her clarity, and her refusal to stay silent, even without a voice, that cracked him wide open. But what came next? No one expected. Because as the trial began, something happened in that courtroom that changed everything I thought I knew about justice. You prepare yourself for a lot in this line of work. Grief, horror, even rage. But what you can never fully prepare for is silence. Not the kind that comes from shock or mourning. I mean the silence that sits heavy in a courtroom when true evil enters the room. That's exactly what happened during the trial of Tommy Lynn Sells. It took over a year for the case to come to trial. By then, Krystal Surles had grown stronger. Her voice was still recovering. It would never return to what it once was, but her courage had only hardened. She was 12 years old now, 2 birthdays older than when she watched her best friend die, and nearly bled to death in the same bed. I remember watching her enter the courtroom that first day. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, and in her eyes, no fear. Just focus. She walked right past the defense table, where Sells sat in a county-issue jumpsuit, and she didn't flinch. But he looked at her. He recognized her. Even after all that time, the face of that 10-year-old girl, the one who had outwitted him, outlived him, stayed burned into his memory. Their eyes locked for just a moment. She told me later, "I wanted to see if he still saw me as a victim, or as the girl who beat him." Sells gave no reaction. No smirk. No twitch. Nothing. In court, Krystal took the stand. It was quiet in the room, quieter than I've ever heard a courtroom. She spoke slowly, sometimes whispering, sometimes writing when her voice couldn't carry the words. But the message was clear. She recounted the night. The shadow in the room. The blade. The way Katie screamed and then went silent. She described pretending to be dead. The pain. The blood. Crawling down the hallway without a voice. Every juror sat frozen. Her testimony wasn't just evidence. It was a declaration that she had survived not just the attack, but the years that followed. Nightmares. Recovery. Relearning how to live without fear. Then the prosecution presented the pattern, crime after crime, that matched Sells' methods. Testimonies from law enforcement across the country. Families who'd lost children. Parents who never got to say goodbye. Dozens of stories. Some confirmed, others just suspected. Together, they painted a portrait of a man who killed not for reason, but for release. Still, Sells showed no emotion. Not when Krystal cried. Not when the photos of Katie's bedroom were displayed. Not when his own confession tapes were played aloud. He just sat there, like he was watching someone else's story unfold. Finally, on April 8, 2014, 15 years after that horrific night, Krystal was invited to attend Sells' execution. She wasn't required to, but she chose to go. Not for revenge. Not for closure. For presence. She wanted him to see her, not broken, not afraid. Just alive. I sat just a few rows back from the witness room. The air was still, cold. Everyone was watching for some sign, some word from the killer. When the prison warden asked Sells if he had any last words, there was a pause. And then, no. That was it. No apology. No explanation. No final confession. Just no. Krystal never took her eyes off him. She told me later that a part of her hoped he would say something. That maybe, in those final moments, there would be a crack in his armor. A flicker of humanity. But there wasn't. Tommy Lynn Sells died the same way he lived, with nothing inside. And yet, somehow, Krystal walked out of that room taller than she walked in. But what happened after, what she did with her life, with her survival, that's the part of this story that still brings hope to a world that sorely needs it. After Tommy Lynn Sells was executed, the story could have ended there. The killer was gone. Justice, at least in the legal sense, was served. But for Krystal, it was never about him. It was about what came next. She was 15 when we first met in person. I had covered the case for years, followed every motion, every report, every hearing. I'd spoken to the sheriff, to EMTs who treated her that night, to attorneys who'd worked the case. But the first time I sat down with Krystal herself, I realized I hadn't fully grasped the depth of her strength. She didn't talk about trauma the way others did. She didn't dramatize it. Didn't flinch from it either. It's just part of me, she told me. But it's not all of me. By then, she had started speaking to classrooms, telling her story, not for shock value, but to help kids understand danger, resilience, and the power of instinct. She became involved with victims' advocacy groups. She stood in courtrooms with other survivors, not as a symbol, but as proof that survival is possible. Her voice was raspy, permanently damaged. But when she spoke, people listened. Because what she lacked in volume, she carried in clarity. She graduated high school, got a job, tried to live as normally as anyone could after surviving something so brutally abnormal. But she never forgot, and she never stopped sharing. One day, I asked her why she kept retelling the story, why she chose to relive that night again and again. Her answer stopped me cold. Because if someone had spoken up before, maybe Katie would still be alive. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for every child still out there, for every parent who never got answers, for every girl lying awake at night wondering if the world will ever feel safe again. Years passed. The world moved on from the headlines. But Krystal didn't fade. She became the face of a movement. Stronger background checks, better coordination between state police departments, support programs for child victims of violent crime. And she never let people forget the victims whose names didn't make the news. Every year on December 31st, the day after Katie was killed, Krystal visits a small memorial bench placed by the Harris family just outside their hometown. No media, no speeches, just a quiet moment to remember her friend. Katie was 13 forever. Krystal kept going for both of them. As a reporter, we often close our stories with a quote, a summary, some neat bow to tie the pain into something readable. But not this time. This story doesn't need polish. It needs truth. So I'll leave you with this. A 10-year-old girl lost her voice to a monster. But she found a louder one in its place. She didn't just survive that night. She won.